Broadcasting from Silicon Valley, California, this is Conversations with Jennylyn.
You're watching Conversations with Jennylyn, and today I have another fascinating guest for you. And he is Dr. John Van D. Lewis, and he's the Managing Director of Terra Global Capital. And I'm very happy he's here to share what Terra Global Capital does and how it's benefiting all of us. So welcome to Conversations with Jennylyn, Dr. Lewis.
Well, thank you, Jennylyn. This is a great opportunity for all of us. Terra Global Capital grew out of the Kyoto Protocol of 1997 in the climate negotiations. And by the time it was put together, those negotiations were past Montreal on their way to Copenhagen, and then they went to Paris and what's called the Paris Agreement, and so on and so forth. Paris Agreement being 5 years old already. But basically, it became clear that coming out of the Kyoto Protocol, that at least 20% of greenhouse gases are put around in the greenhouse effect around the planet and causing global warming. And anyone in Washington, D.C. knows what that means. We've had the hottest July in recorded history this month here. From land use things, which includes methane from livestock and deforestation and agricultural intensification, and the killing of soil microbes, which are carbon by chemical inputs to agriculture. Of course, also, as we're discovering more and more every day, lead to various kinds of cancers, which farmers are being subjected to in developed countries. Luckily, in developing countries, most farmers can't afford those inputs. To make a long story short. Well, that was 20%. And then it became increasingly clear as we moved towards Copenhagen that while land use, now I'm not talking cars, cities, transportation, oil, I'm just talking land use, farming, ranging, fires, logging, oil palm plantations in the rainforest, and so on and so forth. Land use was contributing more than 20%, maybe 25% to greenhouse gases going in the atmosphere. And the greenhouse gases we're talking about related to land use are, of course, carbon dioxide, which goes up every time anything burns, methane, which comes out of livestock and comes out of decomposition of organic matter, so plant refuse, and of course, nitrous oxide, N2O, which comes out of that and is very important. It's like rice paddies emit a lot of nitrous oxides. There's something that happens in mangroves and rice paddies with the water and the land that nitrous oxide goes up. And these are gases that get trapped around the planet and act like a greenhouse. So lo and behold, as the studies continued to be done, we discovered that while land use that I've just described may produce over 20% of global greenhouse gases, some people say 30%, some people say 25%. They are over 50% or half of the solution, because the more trees you have, the more soil organic matter you have, the more livestock you have grazing on the range instead of being grain fed, because when they graze on grasses, they produce less than half as much methane as they do when they're in feedlots eating grain. And the grain has already caused deforestation and the loss of soil organic matter in its cultivation. But anyway, all those things, if you correct them, you've gone beyond 55% of what's called global warming remediation, which is the whole effort in the Paris Agreement to hold the increase in global temperature averages to less than 1.5 degrees centigrade, so that's probably 4 or 5 degrees Fahrenheit, from what it was in 1800, before the Industrial Revolution. So that's as simple as that. And if we don't get back to 1.5 or at least 2%, 2 degrees centigrade increase in the next 9 years, some of these things will be irreversible. What are some of the irreversible things? When the polar ice caps melt, it kills a lot of the plankton. It sort of dilutes the food source for the plankton in the ocean. And the plankton alone, they're plants. They're plankton in the ocean. And plants do what? They do photosynthesis. That's what chlorophyll. It's green. That's why they're green. Plankton has chlorophyll. They remove carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide, when it's removed, becomes carbon, becomes a tree, becomes a plankton. Whereas when it's burnt, whether in our digestive systems or in a forest fire, the carbon becomes carbon dioxide, becomes a greenhouse gas. And it's no longer there in a position to remove carbon dioxide or photosynthesize it into carbon and oxygen. And of course, if we don't photosynthesize enough carbon dioxide, we don't have enough oxygen to breathe. That's another problem. So there is the short answer. And so the state of California passed a law where they were going to regulate carbon or greenhouse gas emissions on the part of municipalities and industry and farms. And they had the California Air Resources Board right near you in San Francisco. And they set up what is probably the best greenhouse gas offset registry in the world, called CCAR, California Climate Action Registry in Sacramento. And the good news is it's pretty disciplined. So when you apply for a greenhouse gas offset credit, there's a rigorous process to show that these are real differences. You've really reduced the methane or the nitrous oxide coming out of irrigated rice in the Central Valley, or you've really put in more trees where there were fewer, or you put in perennial grasses on your rangeland instead of annual grasses, or whatever it's going to be. Then you have a credit, which means something's different. And therefore, instead of being taxed at $100 a ton of carbon dioxide equivalent for your emissions over your allocated amount, allocated amount is another story. But if you go over that, you pay a tax. And it's cheaper to buy a carbon credit for $7 to $10 for a ton of carbon dioxide equivalent than to pay a $100 fine for being a ton over your allocated amount of carbon dioxide equivalent. And all greenhouse gases are calculated in tons of carbon dioxide equivalents, TCO2e. Anyway, so California did, that's the good news. The bad news is they've only set up an interchange with one. So any credit that you do, the things I've described in the United States, you can, if you get it properly measured, validated, a measurement methodology that gets validated and verified for certification by CCAR in Sacramento, you can sell it. For someone who doesn't want to pay $100 a ton tax, they'd rather pay $7 to $10 a ton tax. The trouble is it's just for land use change or other measures, whether and in the other sector, windmills, solar, fuel efficient cars, whatever, more, putting stuff in your industrial chimneys so they emit fewer greenhouse gases and so on, scrubbers. You can only bring in credits from the United States. There was one province in Canada that signed up for the program, Quebec, and the White House tried to block that. You think they'd have better things to do, but they tried to block an exchange of credits from Quebec land use, and British Columbia was looking at it too. That's Canada, where we can't travel anymore. So that's the good news. The bad news is when you go to the tropics, the trees grow twice as fast all year long. Mm-hmm. So those are the trees you want to plant and protect. And those are all voluntary credits. So people have made voluntary commitments to reduce emissions from deforestation, to remove or sequester emissions through reforestation. But if you pay for that, and there's some very vibrant markets, but they're voluntary credits. They help your image, but they're not compliance. It's not a law like it is in California.
So my question is, if we have people in high places, as in the government, who don't share your philosophy, well, it's not even a philosophy, it's you have evidence to support what you're saying. How is this blocking your work?
Well, as I say, the current administration, when they finally figured out what I was talking about, tried to block the treaty between the state of California and the province of Quebec, saying neither of them could do an international treaty because they weren't, the province of Quebec wasn't Canada, and the state of California, even though it's the 6th biggest economy in the world, is not a separate country. It's not a separate country.
We heard that.
So yeah, the administration tried, I mean, they don't know how to pick their fights very well, as you know. And the result of all that is to make the CCAR process and the relationship with California look good. They're kind of heroes around the world in the climate, in the science world.
Yes.
I mean, and it's not just, ivory tower scientists. There's that 15-year-old girl who sailed over with her father from Sweden for climate change at the UN in New York last September. And because these are the people who are going to suffer. Youngsters like her and yourself, by the time this really gets hard to live with. I mean, I have grandchildren, but I will be gone. And I think the teenagers are very mad at our generation for leaving them in the lurch in this way. So we have 9 years to really change our relationship, not only to industry, and that's going well. I mean, the people make more money on solar and windmills than they make on oil anyway. And electric cars, that's going well. That's all, that almost the free market is taking care of this. What we have to change is land use. We have to have incentives to grow food from trees. To make a long story short, it's gonna, at the end of the day, because when you clear land to grow annual crops, unless you do it very creatively with off-season nitrogen fixing cover crops like alfalfa, or you do farming in rows along the contour and so on, it's very important that we live off of trees and not off annual crops, because annual crops go to seed, and if the seed has to regenerate, and so for months you don't have ground cover. And you get wind erosion, dirt erosion, it doesn't hold the water washes off and floods. For example, the city of Houston, as you know, flooded quite seriously, and it's about to flood again with this new. And so they're really pulling their farmers back from using fertilizer, which is, of course, fertilizer is a byproduct of oil refineries. So the oil companies down there like to sell fertilizer, but it kills the microbes in the soil that otherwise sponge up the water, and you need to sponge up the water and keep it on the land, which only happens with soil organic matter or microbes, which are plants. They're carbon. They sequester, they photosynthesize carbon dioxide and sequester carbon. And plants can grow with that, particularly the right combination of soil microbes and soil fungus, without fertilizer, which of course is not what the fertilizer companies want to hear. But these are big changes, just like with the pandemic shutdown. They're big changes. They're certain kinds of architecture, certain kinds of entertainment that'll come back strong, and other kinds will not recover from this. Just like petroleum-based industries. I mean, coal hasn't been profitable for decades without the subsidies. And yet, West Virginia, which is a coal state, I come from a coal state, Pennsylvania, they could make more money by just putting windmills on the top of each one of their mountains instead of.
Why do you think you're getting such pushback from the White House?
Well, that that's what has worked on television. You know, being a naysayer. That's what they call in French télé-réalité. It's about the soundbite. It's about we get our information not through careful study of complex topics, through books. We get the one-liner. And the tobacco industry did it earlier. In fact, the same consulting firms that were hired by the tobacco industry to try and prove that tobacco didn't cause cancer were then hired by the climate denialosphere, companies in the denialosphere, particularly oil companies. Although most of them have been, you know, BP used to be called British Petroleum. Now it's called Beyond Petroleum. So, you know, it's television reality. It's populism. It's demagoguery. People like simple answers, especially when they don't read books and they watch television all day. They want simple answers. And it was a simple knee-jerk answer. And they're saying these scientists wouldn't talk to you because you're not a scientist. So they don't like you, so you don't like them. So it's anti-intellectualism. Anti-intellectualism in American life cannot be overestimated.
Well,
it was the way we justified our history. Mm-hmm.
This is beyond ignorance when you have so much to show of damage that's already been done, and that we are getting close to a place where it will be irreversible, to be so nonchalant about this evidence. What are you planning to do to change that? Because it's
I think the anti-intellectualism of the current administration and the Tea Party movement that led up to it has run its course.
What does that mean?
Well, those people, first of all, they're dying at higher rates than anywhere else in the world because of lack of a science-guided policy in public health. And this is a public health problem, climate change. And so even if someone my age says, I think those scientists are all full of themselves, and they're pretty arrogant people, I agree, and they wouldn't give me the time of day because I'm not a scientist. I have a PhD, but in social science. They don't like me, so why should I like them? Except they're right, you know? And so I think a lot of these people, women, were bamboozled by their husbands. Their husbands were feeling defensive because they didn't have the opportunity to go to college. It's not their fault. So it's like, I couldn't go to college, so it doesn't matter I didn't go to college. Or, you know, they weren't thoughtful, their peer group. You know, they were more important being anti-intellectual than being intellectual. But now their children are getting after them. So I think a lot of that Tea Party support will evaporate. And historians will figure out why it came on so strong, but my theory in my long life is things really changed in American politics, American political culture after the Cold War. I mean, you know, I was negotiating projects in Africa. I worked for USAID. You talk about Terra Global Capital, that's after I retired. I'm a retired foreign service officer from the US Foreign Aid Program. And we were negotiating some forest tenure reforms with African governments. And they wouldn't budge because they had strong militaries that were all supplied by the Soviets. And then we were in a meeting in Paris once, and we broke for lunch and went downstairs to the restaurant, and there was a TV, and it showed Yeltsin standing up to the Soviet tanks. And they realized the Soviet Union was falling apart and their armies wouldn't get free rifles and ammunition anymore in order to put down demonstrations in all their capitals. They went right upstairs, and that same afternoon, they agreed to change their forest policies. So that's an example. The Soviet Union and these governments could play these world powers off against each other. And that doesn't work anymore. That doesn't work any well. I mean, people say, oh, well, they're using China to play off against the West, but China is not as stupid as the Soviet Union was in that respect. They want Africa to work for them, of course, but they want it to work. Whereas the Soviets just wanted us not to have it. They knew they couldn't develop it themselves. They just went. But when the Cold War ended, then America became what Clinton called a hyperpower. And so everyone, in game theory, instead of it being the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc against the Western countries, democracies, and led by the United States, when the Soviet bloc was gone, and here was the European Union allied to the United States until this year, then the power, if you say American society and institutions had 80% of the power in the world, then the divide would be within the United States, and that's exactly what happened. So people decided, well, the only powerful people out there are my neighbors, and this is what I don't like about them. And so you got a polarization in American society, and now it has brought us to our knees. We are on our knees economically and in terms of public health, and so we have to come together again, which is a process that started because we've lost so much power. You know, power, you can't measure it, but in history is all about power, and we've lost it. So if we had 80% of the power in the world after the Cold War, we maybe have 40% now. And so we have to unite to get it back.
Well, we're almost out of time. And before can you believe how quickly the time flies when I'm getting smart? But before we wrap up, I must ask you, how do you see Terra Capital changing this? Because we have to change it.
Well, Terra Global Capital.
Like you say, for the next generation, if we can't get it done in our time.
Well, Terra Global Capital works on the financing of landscape carbon assets. So the things I've talked about, climate smart agriculture, afforestation, reforestation, avoided deforestation, they turn those into bankable credits. And when it's in the US, they can be sold in the compliance market in California. When it's overseas, they're voluntary markets. But so and how you measure that involves a lot of complex remote sensing, geographic information system, computer technologies, which nobody over 40 can manage. So there's a very young staff. Turning, if you will, carbon as an economic asset as opposed to carbon dioxide, which is a cost of progress that's been a free cost. You know, nobody's paid for natural resource mining in any industry, in any sector, and that's what turning landscape carbon into an asset. So that's what Terra Global Capital does, and there's some other firms in the Bay Area which do it around the world. They love to go to the tropics because they say that the plants and the trees sequester more carbon per acre, per hectare, per year, per month, whatever, than in temperate climates like North America.
Well, I grew up in the tropics, so I have to agree
Where?
with that.
Tell me.
I grew up in Guyana. There are three. There's a British, a Dutch, and a French. I was raised in what was formerly known as British Guyana. So I have a British education, and I grew up practically in the jungle. I grew up on the border of Guyana and Venezuela.
Well,
So
that's a
I
fascinating country.
Yes.
And actually, Prince Charles' forest protection movement, Guyana was their principal country they worked in.
Oh.
Of course, he made a slip in one of his brochures and he called it British Guyana, even though it's an independent country. But anyway, Guyana has done some interesting things, more so than their neighbors, Venezuela or Brazil, in terms of what's called forest protection.
Yes.
Or avoided deforestation.
Yes. We have so many exotic birds and animals, and it's so beautiful and untouched. It's virgin, you know? And I think that they probably aren't having some of the global warming issues that we may be experiencing here.
No, they haven't, and they should be paid because they're sequestering they're probably sequestering as much carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere as half of the United States because they have so many trees. And the whole idea, Terra Global Capital, is you quantify that and you sell it. And Guyana can say, we're going to cut down our trees and sell the lumber unless you pay us for this, what's called ecosystem services that we're giving you, which is we're removing carbon dioxide into our jungles through photosynthesis. Mm-hmm. So that in a fair world, these countries that like Guyana that are protecting their rainforest should be paid to do so, because that's an ecosystem services that benefits us.
Well, go ahead and organize it. They need the money. You can help them.
I mean, it's one of the countries, and it comes up a lot. And I think a problem with them getting the full credit for what's called a RED credit, reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation, is because they haven't controlled the mercury being used in gold mining in the jungle. So they're polluting in that sense. So the ecosystem, there's an ecosystem disservice there in terms of these outlaw gold miners in southern Guyana.
But on the grand scheme of things, that's a very small scale, the gold mining in Guyana. So it's still at a stage where it can be reversed and controlled.
Well, I will, when we have lunch in the Bay Area, I will have some answers for you on the next forest carbon credit in Guyana. I will have my people look that up.
I'm very well connected there. So if you need some connections, let me know.
Oh, that's very good. In fact, I may talk to someone in Terra who's, right up there in downtown San Francisco to take a look at what's in Guyana and then start a conversation with your connections.
Wonderful.
They were a big focus of, as I say, Prince Charles's effort and the Clinton Foundation. And in the last couple of years, I haven't heard what's going on there. But the ex-president, in fact, went to work for one of these international organizations. And then something went wrong. I don't know the details.
Okay.
But for you, I will find out.
Thank you. We're almost out of time. Well, we're out. But what do you want to leave with my viewers that I haven't asked you? Did you think it's critical that's out there?
Well, I think the most important thing in this process is, yes, buying the offset, but who owns the land? I mean, it's very important that people, small farmers, poor people, poor rural people, are allowed to control their land. And in too many third world countries, the government says, we own the land. And if they want to cut the tree, they cut the tree. And land doesn't get approved. Ironically, more land gets approved in Ethiopia because it has a feudal system where a farmer has to give up half of what he grows to his landowning overlaw, but the landowning overlaw in their feudal system will never kick him off the land. So if he puts a tree in there, it'll be there for his children. What people want is to plant a tree that their children will have access to. But if you make your land look too good in too many developing countries, then some fat cat is going to take it away from you. So I think land tenure security. And actually, there's a very good program on international land tenure at the University of California, Davis, if you know where that is.
Yeah.
I know you know where it is. And I think that's the most important thing. And I used to be a historian before I had to start supporting my family. And I read that one reason the whole world speaks English, my ancestors didn't speak English, your ancestors didn't speak English, and now we're speaking English together. Because England, for whatever reason, in 1532 had a land law where Henry VIII's minister, Cardinal Wolsey, said, if you pay your taxes, and even if we cut your head off in the Tower of London, your son gets the land. The king will never take the land away. And France didn't have that. So France doesn't have nearly the same oak trees around. And so people, suddenly there are oak trees from that year that are still alive, holding the sides of field, preserving the soil fertility. Farmers know how to, everything I said, every farmer knows, or they would have starved to death. They know all this. But if they implement it too well and the land becomes too valuable or too well taken care of, then someone will ride up and say, I have title. And you have to have that security. And England had it, and then, we had it, and India's doing very well because they have that kind of law, the land tenure law. That's the big one. California has it. California's agriculture, as you know, has been a huge success. And that's the one thing. And I'm sure your country, Guyana, has the same laws. I don't know if they're observed all the time, but there'll be an honest judge every so often, and that makes a big difference. Which is perhaps why they did some of these reforestation programs or avoided deforestation programs in Guyana, because they had better laws than, say, French Guyana or Suriname.
Yes. Well, Guyana is approximately the same size of California, and they haven't even got 1 million people there. So the majority of the country is forest. I mean, you would be amazed if you visited how much of it is untouched.
Well, the world should pay Guyana for that forest because it's removing carbon dioxide.
Well, who better to organize it than you?
Well, we'll get Terra Global Capital on it, and I will be sure when I get out there. But in the meantime, I may send someone to see you.
Oh, wonderful. I've really enjoyed this, and I'm so much smarter for having spent this time with you. I hope I asked you all the right questions.
You were great. I enjoyed being interviewed by you.
Thank you. We'll do it again because you're continuing to come up with new developments, and I'd like to keep people informed as much as I can through you, okay? Thank you so much for watching Conversations with Jennylyn. We know that global warming continues to be an issue, and if you are someone who does not believe it's a problem, you should get in touch with John and remain informed, because it's important, if not for us, for our grandchildren and for the other people that inhabit this planet. So once again, thank you for watching Conversations with Jennylyn. When a conversation is all you need to be inspired, just like the inspiration and the education we have just gotten from John. And John, thank you so much.
Broadcasting from Silicon Valley, California, this is Conversations with Jennylyn.